Hello, and welcome to another edition of A Reader's Paradise. I'm your host, Earl Sewell, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Before the podcast ends, stick around. You will get a couple of promotional codes for an audiobook that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Also, stick around and listen to an excerpt from another podcast I do called Lennie Gray. So with that being said, let's dive right into today's show. Ladies and gentlemen, today I have a wonderful, wonderful author by the name of Steve Bellinger. Let me tell you a little bit about Steve. Steve has written this. Steve is a science fiction author, and he has written a wonderful, wonderful novel, fiction novel called The Chrono Car. Take a listen to this. Imagine that you're born the son of a slave with a genius mind. And you're living in Mississippi in the late 1800s, like the 1880s. And you are such a genius, but during the time period you live in, it is difficult for you to do anything in America because of the way the society is set up. Now, fast forward about 125 years, and a young college student, a young engineering college student, finds some plans to build a chrono car that this former son of a slave had designed, and it actually works. And that's where I'm going to stop right there about the book written by Steve Bellinger called The Chrono Car. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Steve. And Steve, how are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you?
I am doing great. And Steve, will you please give us a little bit of your bio? Can you give us a little bit more of your background? Like, how did you start writing? Those sorts of things.
I started out very young. I fell in love with science fiction as a kid. My mom used to work for a printing company, and she would bring books and magazines home. And one night she brought a copy of Isaac Asimov's I, Robot. And I fell in love with science fiction from that point on. Now, over the years, I've written everything from radio drama to Sunday school lessons to newspaper articles. I've been writing science fiction maybe for the past 10, 20 years, and The Chronocar is my first novel, my first published novel. So I've been doing it for a while.
Wow, The Chronocar is your first published novel. So with that being said, The Chronocar is such a fascinating story, such a fascinating storyline that I know from all of the years that I've been a writer and an avid reader, I hadn't seen anything like that. How did you come up with the concept of that story?
So I'm pretty much very big on hard science fiction, even though a lot of people don't realize how hard the science fiction is. A lot of people who claim to not like science fiction have fallen in love with the story.
You know what I'm noticing more and more these days is that science fiction has become so much more mainstream than I think people may realize, because and I'm thinking specifically, with television and movies, and there's a lot of science fiction stuff out there, metahumans and all of that stuff that fall under that science fiction genre. And it's also interesting, that's just something that I just, have been noticing. And it's also interesting that you say that it actually deals with, actual time travel, the actual science of it. So let me ask you, this is maybe a little bit of a weird question, but do you actually think that at some point we will be able to actually engage in time travel?
Like in my story? Not a chance. I don't think it's possible. That's why it's science. That's why it's science fiction.
I say that because what I'm finding interesting is I'm reading right now. I'm narrating a book by an astronaut by the name of Leland Melvin, and in his books, in his memoir, he talks about the impossible becoming possible, which is really interesting. With trying to discover the secrets of the universe. And so I'm finding that one really fascinating, but I'm also, it's also interesting that, I read recently that we're launching a probe to go to the sun. Have you heard about that one?
Oh yeah. I mean, space travel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Let me tell you a story.
Okay.
I had a friend who, I'm one of the world's oldest Star Trek fans, okay? And I had a friend, we got into a debate over whether warp speed, traveling at multiples of the speed of light, would ever be possible. Well, I told him that I didn't think it would be. His response was, they said that about the speed of sound. Okay. He went to get his MBA, took a couple of classes in physics, and came back and apologized to me, because that's a whole order of magnitude. There are things that are possible that are going to happen. There are some things that I think may not be possible. There are concepts, even in Star Trek, when you talk about traveling faster than the speed of light. I mean, what keeps you, when they accelerate that quickly, from being smashed into the back of the ship? I mean, they have to make up things and make up more things for it all to make sense. So, and traveling through time, I'll go back to what Dr. Stephen Hawking says. Where's the visitor from the future? Where are they? If time travel is possible.
Okay. Where's the visitor from the future? Interesting. Okay. All right. Cool. I can respect that. I think, if time travel were ever possible, I'm not sure what kind of world we would live in. I think one of the things, not to give too much away from the book, one of the things that you allude to in the book is, the chaotic order of things that may happen if, time travel, if the timeline continuum was ever interrupted. I found that to be fascinating, in your story. Let me ask you another question. This is a writer's question. Does writing energize you, or does it exhaust you? What is writing like for you?
I write haphazardly. I don't do outlines, and I write when the muse hits me. So therefore, it is energizing. Once I will lay in bed for nights on end, trying to think of some plot device or whatever, and when it hits me, bam, I'm up all night writing.
Okay.
So I don't give myself any deadlines or anything.
So when you write, you just go ahead and get it all out right then, and then you try to shape the work afterwards. That's how it works.
Oh yeah, of course you go back and do some editing, but usually by the time I sit down, I've got a lot of it together in my head.
That's an interesting thing. One of the things I teach my students, I'll often tell my students that writing is not sitting at the keyboard and typing. That's not the beginning of writing. Writing actually takes first inside of your mind, because you have to visualize it. You have to see it before you can, bring life to it on a keyboard. And so sometimes,
absolutely.
Yeah. So that's what I tell my students, whenever they have a writing question. I said, it starts in your mind. Writing is a thinking event. It is a thinking process, and you have to really be, attuned to how you think and how you put story together and so that's very important. Let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite book that you can read time and again? And if so, what's the name of that book?
Oh, good grief. I mean, most of the, I'm not sure there's any one single favorite book. I mean, I'm a big fan of classic sci-fi, like, again, Asimov and Bradbury and whatever. A lot of the modern stuff, I don't know. Well, let me put it here this way. What a lot of people call science fiction, I think is incorrectly defined. To me, in science fiction, the science of the story has to be so central to it that without that science, it would fall apart. Which means that Star Wars is not science fiction. Only about half of Star Trek is real science fiction. I'm not very big on fantasy, like, the magic and everything. I want some science that I can believe in. One trick that I tried to use in the Chrono Car is, again, something I learned from Asimov, is to start off with a little bit of real science and then extrapolate from there. And as a result, I've had more than one person come to me and say, Steve, is this real? Because it's so believable, because it starts off with the real thing. Does that make sense?
Yes. Because the argument that, is put forth in the book, it asks logical questions. There's a lot of logical questions that are answered, and the way that you respond to some of those scientific questions, if you will, pulls you into the story and makes the reader accept the answers that are given and say, okay, I'll go along for this ride in this particular story. And so that was one of the things that I know when I read the work that fascinated me about it. And I'm thinking of the two characters, by the time that the Tony and
Jimmy in the beginning.
Yeah, Tony and Jimmy in the beginning of the story, how they are, when Tony's has first built the machine and Jimmy's asking all these questions. And so it was really interesting how they played off of each other. One being the skeptic and the other being the, optimist. And, it was just really, really interesting how they went back and forth with that.
Well, as a writer, that was a very sneaky way of doing an info dump.
Yeah. get all the information in there, while you can. And that was another interesting thing about the novel was the pacing of it. The novel is a very evenly paced book. When the reader is introduced to the story, we start off in the 19th century. And when we fast forward, you do that so seamlessly to transition from, being in 19th century America to suddenly being in the new millennium and, the 2015s in the book. You do that so seamlessly. Was that a difficult thing for you to do? Like, how did you come up with that?
Well, let me tell you the story. The first two chapters that everybody loved so much was actually the last thing I wrote. The story originally started with what is now chapter 3. But so many people who read, the preliminary manuscript kept saying, we wanted more backstory on Dr. Johnson. So I came up with that stuff to flesh his character out. And I'm as surprised as anyone else as how well that came about.
Man, let me tell you, that came out so incredibly good. The way you wrote that, the way that Simi and the character Black Pete, and the Jefferson and all of them, came together in those first two chapters. I mean, it just pulls you right in. I mean, it just pulls you right in to their world and into their lives. And the other thing, and I want you to talk about this a bit too, is you really intermingle into the storyline history, American history, specifically American history viewed through the lens of the African American experience. Why was that so important to your writing?
A lot of some of the things that happened in those first two chapters are based on stories my grandpa told me.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the Tony Carpenter character is based on me. He was an IIT student. I was an IIT student. And in a lot of the ways that he would respond, I would ask myself, well, Steve, what would you have done back then? Then I'd write just the opposite.
Okay.
So in many ways, I cheated. So
in many ways, you cheated. Okay. So so let me make sure I heard you right. You're saying that the story, in the beginning of the book, they were stories you heard from. Was it you said your grandfather or your father?
My grandfather. Some of the stories came from my grandfather. Some of the names I borrowed from relatives and friends. I mean, there's a lot of personal history, hidden in there.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly, but just some little details.
Oh yeah. I understand. I get that.
I mean, I don't have a grandfather who built a time machine.
Okay.
At least I don't think so.
At least not that you know of. Okay. I got it.
I may find out tomorrow. He may show up here, and then I'll know.
Yeah, and tell you tempest minimum.
There you go.
For those of you who don't know what that is, you have to read the book, to understand that. Let me ask you this other writer's question, and then we'll come back to the book. about how long does it take you to write a novel on average? Do you have like an approximate time it takes you to get something done?
I am totally non-structured and non-disciplined. I've been a member of a couple of writers groups, and I've heard them say things like, I'm going to write 1,500 words tonight. I can't do that. When it hits me, I might write 3,000 words. The Chronocar took about 4 years because there's a lot of research involved. Mm-hmm. And I literally went to the library because I wanted to read the newspaper articles so I could be as accurate as possible. Now, my second novel, Edge of Perception, I wrote in 8 months. Because I guess I'm getting the hang of it.
Yeah. It's interesting. We both share the love of writing, perspective, or writing history, putting history in books. So I have written historical fiction too, but not science fiction. Going into the genre of historical fiction has been, really, really interesting for me personally, because the one of the stories I wrote happens to, dealt with me doing genealogy work on my father's side of the family and trying to understand what people of color went through in the early part of the 20th century. Because so much of that history is suppressed from history books, and a lot of people don't like to talk about, what went on during that time. And so one of the things that I found really, really enjoyable about the work was the authenticity of it. You did not write a story about time travel and then put a bunch of flowers on it. You really went back into that time and you allow the reader to truly understand what it's like. And I really enjoyed how you played a person from the 21st century from early 21st century going back to early 20th century as a person of color. And what the person from the future knows and brings back to the past, and how someone in the past doesn't know the future. And it was really interesting how you played between that. I mean, that was just almost genius, how that worked.
Well, I don't know if I use the word genius, but all I did was put myself in that position. Mm-hmm. What would I do if I saw this? When I realized that our elevated trains here have been around for so long that they existed back then, mm-hmm. What would my response what would it have been? And again, in some ways, I feel like I cheated because, again, the story is about me. It's about me if I were in that position. So it wasn't that difficult, I guess.
Okay. Well.
But I appreciate the fact that people enjoy it.
Yeah. Because it's like you put yourself into that. You can tell that there was a lot of care put into this particular book, into this particular novel. Let me ask you this. I know you've mentioned some writers that you like, but if you could travel back in time and meet any author and have a cup of coffee with them, who would that author be?
My first choice would probably be Isaac Asimov, although part of me would love to be sitting at the table with Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick while they were working on 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is, I think, the greatest science fiction film ever made.
Yeah, tell us about that film real quickly, because I'm very fuzzy on that one. I sort of remember it, but, for the listeners, let's help them remember.
Well, it's very hard to describe, and a lot of people hated it because it moved so slowly. But it started off with the dawn of man, apes. In fact, the story goes that it didn't win the Academy Award for costuming because the people may have thought that the apes were real. Kubrick invented all sorts of special effects. I mean, it's almost impossible to describe the film. I invite people to sort of look it up. You either love it or you hate it. I've seen it more times than many people have seen Star Wars. It's just a great film. And it's pure science fiction.
Oh, okay. So, and that's 2001, as the, or Space Odyssey.
Well,
too.
I can,
Go ahead.
yeah, I can date myself. It was released in 1968, and I saw it first run.
Well, that's okay because I wasn't born until 2000. I'm just 20.
So there you go. See, we're laughing about all of this, but when you talk about the Chronocar, I mean, it was actually published for the first time 5 years ago. I was 65 years old when it was published.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
And now I've actually got what is Edge of Perception, which came out last summer. I've got another manuscript I'll be submitting soon, and I've actually finished a second draft of the sequel to the Chronocar, which will have even more history in it.
You're doing a sequel to the Chrono Car?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh my goodness! I got to find out what happened. Well, Tony's. Well, I won't ask. Well,
just think about it.
Okay, I'll think about it. I'll have to think about it as a writer and look and say, okay, what could happen here? Maybe Ollie's going to do some time traveling.
Well. Part of the question is that knowing the effect of time travel on everything, what happens if it continues to happen? I'll give away one tiny thing, which kind of comes across in the first story. It is not that hard to build a time machine.
Oh, okay.
And that is part of the danger.
That is part of the danger because that means somebody else is going to do it. I got it. Oh, that's a good one. Okay. All right. I can't wait for that one. Got to keep me posted on that one. I want to read that one.
Yeah. Well, hopefully before the year is out, I'll have it going.
So at this moment, we're going to take a break and we're going to listen to an excerpt from Steve Bellinger's The Chrono Car. Black Pete was big, dark-skinned, and had even less sense than Willie. Simmy walked a few paces ahead of them, lost in thought. The quality of motion, which is collected by taking the sum of the motions directed toward the same parts, and the difference of those that are directed to the contrary parts, suffers no change from the action of bodies among themselves. Hey, Simmy! What? Simmy said, annoyed at the interruption. How come it is that you so smart? Willie asked. What? I mean, you can read, you can do ciphering. You're about as smart as any white man. Simmy stopped and looked at him. Maybe smarter. But why? Willie said. Yeah, why? Black Pete parroted. Simmy shrugged. I guess the good Lord saw fit to bless me with a good mind. But why? Willie asked again. I don't know. Ask him. Simmy pointed toward the sky as he started walking again. It don't make no sense. Willie puzzled. Why would the Lord give them kind of smarts to a colored man? What the hell are you talking about, Willie? Simmy stopped walking again. You smart, Simmy. Smarter than all the white men we works for. But what can you do with it? Simmy turned and resumed his pace. I got plans. Well, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that excerpt from the Chrono Car, which is an urban adventure in time. It is a wonderful, wonderful time travel story that deals with a lot of historical stuff. So, Steve, let me ask you this. Are you doing any other work as far as history goes?
Well, I finished the second draft of a sequel to the Chronocar, which involves a little more history because it covers more time periods. And really everything I've done, because there's like 4 books that I've done. It's almost a series, and they all take place in Chicago, and they all have some historical aspect. The second novel, The Edge of Perception, which is a paranormal science fiction love story, which it involves the paranormal, it involves science fiction, and it all takes place on Goose Island. And I had a heck of a time writing that. It was a lot of fun.
So when you do your research, like, where do you go? Do you work with anybody? Do you go just to the library? Do you go to historical societies? Like, how do you go through and get through all of the historical information that you need to write a book? And how do you know what to choose and what not to choose?
Well, the answer to your question is yes to all of the above. And I also make a point to go to the actual location. I walked up and down 47th Street several times to get a feel for what that was like before I wrote that chapter 3. I spent a lot of time on Goose Island for the second story. There's a scene where he's describing what he's seeing out of a window, which literally came from my standing on Goose Island and just looking around. So I like to get a little realistic whenever possible. I like the thought that someone may pick that up and say, hey, I've seen that. Hey, that's right. That's exactly how that looks. You know, and then as far, other research, I will admit that I cheat now and I do more stuff online. But the Chronocar, I was almost exclusively in the library looking at microfilm and going through books. Because back when I was writing that, the internet wasn't very reliable like it is now.
Like it is now, yeah. At one point, I used to work at a library. I used to work at a public library. And one of the things that I loved about my job is the fact that I got to read. And nobody would get, angry with me about being on the job reading. But another thing that always fascinated me about the public library was that I could find these historical photo books. And I would spend so much time at the library with a magnifying glass trying to see every detail of a photo that was taken, 100 or 110, 120 years, prior to me living. And I always found it fascinating just to study that sort of thing, to look at things like that in such detail, to make sure that I pick up every, nook and cranny of the photo. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I know when I was writing, one of my historical book, Lennie Gray, which takes place in the American South. And whatever photos that I could find from that era, I really, really scrutinized those photos to get a sense of every detail, like people didn't have shoes on their feet. Little details like that I ended up putting into the storyline that, helped to bring authenticity to it. And like you, I actually went and I stood in the place that I was writing about in Mississippi.
And isn't that amazing when you can do that?
Yeah, because it's almost like you're standing in a space and you really just you have to get the sense of it, the feel of it, the smell of it. There's something about just, connecting to that part of the earth that, helps to bring a moment to life in your mind. And so when you sit down and in your mind's eye, you put your characters where you want them to be, exactly, what they sense, exactly what they feel, exactly the sounds that they hear. Well, Steve, we have been going for about 43 minutes. I want to take a moment to thank you for taking the time to, be interviewed on the show. Give people some information about you. Where can they find your website and those sorts of things?
Well, the website about me with all of that information is stevebellinger.com. If you go to bellingerbooks.com, you will see all the information about my books and my wife's book. She is a business coach. And so check them both out.
Okay. All right. So with that being said, stick around and I will be giving away a couple of free ACX codes to Steve Bellinger's The Chrono Car. Until next time, happy listening. Katie Books Productions presents Lennie Gray, an audio drama, written, produced, and narrated by Earl Sewell. Previously on Lennie Gray. Lennie Gray slowly lowered herself to her knees, threaded her fingers together, and dropped her head between their shoulders, and begged, "Please, Mr. Bettis, in the name of the Lord, let Tangy May go." In that instant, Lennie Gray heard a bone-crushing thud, and Tangy May was silenced. Lennie Gray screamed out and rushed toward the car, but the sheriff clubbed her with his nightstick and knocked her unconscious. Then, it started raining. It was 8 months ago when Lennie Gray saw John, the one-armed gravedigger, roll past her shanty with an empty coffin and shovel in the back of his wagon. At the time, she had not seen Tangy May and feared that John had her on his wagon. Covering her head with a scarf, she ran out into the pouring rain to ask him, "Who you got in that wagon, John?" Lennie Gray asked before he passed completely by. John was wearing a black hat that had small streams of water cascading off of its brim. Even in the relentless rain, his dark eyes, that were like red-hot kindling, could not be snuffed out. "Nobody yet. Sheriff told me I could find a body down by the river. He said it looks like somebody drowned, and he wants me to pick it up before it washes upstream." When John finished speaking, Lennie Gray heard the oddest voice in her mind. It said, "Go." And Lennie Gray felt as if someone had placed their hand at the center of her back and nudged her forward. "I'm going with you," she whispered before climbing aboard. "Fine by me." John made a clicking sound, and his mule obeyed. When John and Lennie Gray arrived at the river, they walked along its bank looking for a person. Lennie Gray spotted Tangy May first. Her dress was pulled above her hips. Her undergarments were in the mud beside her, and her skin was pale from being exposed. Lennie Gray cried out as she hurriedly moved towards Tangy May's body. She had hoped she had found her in time enough to save her life before John buried her unnecessarily. Tangy May was beaten so badly that her head was permanently misshapen. She had also suffered a stroke that left one side of her body paralyzed and her lips twisted toward her right ear. Her right leg drugged the ground behind her as if it were some useless body part. As a result of the rape, Tangy May was also 8 months pregnant. Tangy May's virtue and well-being were stolen from her, and as a result of it, she fell into a mental darkness where no light could shine through. She would not comb her hair. She tore out her eyelashes with her fingernails and used the bathroom on herself and refused to bathe. Tangy May now resided in the shanty adjacent to Lennie Gray and Curly, and said numerous times that she did not want to give birth to the evil growing inside of her. No matter how hard she tried, her mind and emotions could not create space to love a child that she considered to be wicked. Tangy May loathed its existence inside of her and believed that if born, the child would develop unnatural powers and set everything on earth ablaze. Lennie Gray hoped that as the baby got older, Tangy May's heart would change, but that would take nothing short of a miracle from God. Tangy? Lennie Gray called out her name before entering Tangy's shanty. It was April, and it was still raining heavily. The bricks that Tangy May's shanty were on weren't high enough to keep water from seeping through the floor. Lennie Gray removed a towel that was hanging on a nearby nail to dry herself. After hanging the towel back on the nail, she stepped through small puddles of water towards Tangy May. I'm sorry for tracking mud in here, Tangy. The ground outside is so full of water that when I step, my foot sinks into the ground and gets stuck. Tangy did not respond. Making sure her hands were dry, Lennie Gray pulled out a letter she hoped would have the ability to tug Tangy out of the dark place her mind was in. Tangy, I got a letter here. Lennie Gray held up the envelope. Tangy was sitting in a chair, glaring out the window at the relentless rain. It's from New York. I got it from Miss Lucy. Tangy turned her attention toward Lennie Gray and focused on the letter. Don't matter. Tangy's eyes were low and filled with despair. Just don't matter, she said again, not bothering to catch the saliva spooling out of her mouth and onto her dune of motherhood. Don't you want to know what it say? Lennie Gray asked. Tangy responded by allowing tears to spill over from her eyes. Lennie Gray moved closer and placed her hand on Tangy May's shoulder. You know I can't read so good, but I'll try. Once the letter was open, Lennie Gray unfolded it. It's from Duke, Lennie Gray said, recognizing the spelling of his name. I see the words, not dead, and the word, alive. Showing excitement, Lennie Gray said, I think he's saying he's alive, Tangy. Lennie kept searching for words she recognized. Harlem? Tangy, I think he wants you to come up to Harlem. Ain't that great, Tangy? Here, look at it to make sure it's saying what I think it's saying. Turning her head away from the letter, Tangy May said, Won't be no place after a while. Been raining longer than 40 days and nights. God heard me. Tangy, you're not making any sense. You should read this letter. Lennie Gray extended her arm, trying to force Tangy to take the letter. As she did, the roof of Tangy's shanty began to leak heavily and wet the letter. Lennie Gray quickly pulled it out of the stream of water. Neither woman said anything. The only sound between them was the persistent dripping of water leaking in from the roof and splashing in puddles on the floor. The people of Tallahatchie County had never witnessed or experienced anything remotely close to the amount of rain that the heavens released. The sky became pregnant with grief in August of 1926, on the day Tangy May was taken and assaulted. On that day, the sky released an onslaught of water that had not stopped for 8 straight months. The heavy rains turned the ground into something softer than billowy clouds. Tangy May saw it as a sign from the Lord. He was mad about what had happened to her. He was mad that Satan's darkness had attacked his faithful servant and planted an evil seed. God, in an act of vengeance, was once again going to destroy the planet and start over. It was during the night when the river got angry and started swallowing the earth. People exited their shanties when they heard and felt the ground roaring and trembling. Trees had been uprooted, cars from the white section of town were floating, and shanties slid off of their foundations and ran with the flow of water. Lennie Gray exited her shanty and moved as quickly as she could through the pouring rain to Tangy May's place. Before walking in, she noticed that one side of Tangy May's shanty had slid off of its foundation and was on the ground. Lennie Gray hurried inside with her lantern held up so that she could see. She found Tangi May on the floor of her shanty. Tangi's image struck a hard, jagged shadow against the fallen wall. Water and mud were oozing through the open spaces between the floor and wall, but Tangi didn't seem to care that she was in danger. "Tangi, we got to go!" Lennie Gray approached Tangi, who smelled like a mixture of urine and mud. "What for?" Tangi spoke slowly, like molasses, as saliva spooled unobstructed out of her mouth. "A flood coming, Tangi. We got to leave. We might drown." A low, dark laugh passed through Tangi May's lips that made Lennie Gray nervous. "Tangi, come on! I don't want nothing to happen to you." Lennie Gray moved towards her. "Too late. Nothing you can do for me. I ain't going." "God can, Tangi." Lennie Gray noticed that Tangi May's eyes were darting from right to left. It was as if she was trying to figure out something inside of her mind. "Tangi, come on. Curly say we got to go. The river's gonna get here quick and flood everything. Tangi, look, water's pouring in here. None of us know how to swim, Tangi. You're gonna die if you don't come along." "God answering me, Lennie. He answering me in only a way that God can." "What are you talking about, Tangi?" "He flooding the earth for me. I prayed about this. I told him he need to kill man folks so they don't hurt each other no more. Just for me, Lennie. God doing it just for me, 'cause I'm his favorite. He killing everybody the way I asked him to." Shh. Tangi put her index fingers to her lips. "God walking the earth with a heavy heel. Can you hear him? Can you feel him? He coming, Lennie."
Marshall Turner's life is a dream come true. He has a successful law enforcement career. He's married to a woman he passionately loves. And he has a daughter who makes his heart swell with pride. Then, in the blink of an eye, tragedy strikes when Luther Parker, a drifter, kills Marshall's beloved daughter and flees into hiding. But living as a fugitive is never easy, especially since Marshall and the police had launched a massive manhunt to track him down. But Marshall has to decide whether to bring Luther to justice or have his vengeance. In Have Mercy, the national best-selling and award-winning author Earl Sewell delivers it all with his riveting tale full of intrigue and suspense. Download your copy of Have Mercy today, exclusively on Amazon.com.